Hello guys, shall we start? Or are we waiting for somebody to join?
I think we can start.
Okay, I don't have anything specific on the agenda per se today. I see one update by Nikhil saying that we probably need to communicate the different solutions the SIG is working on. So I think we need to consolidate that list. And I don't think it's a different solution the SIG is working on. The only two different things that still hold good are cluster registry and the federation effort.
And
Federation,
multi-cluster ingress.
yeah, yeah. So uh, people who are working on these different solutions can probably talk about them. Cluster registry and multi-cluster ingress can respectively be talked about by Jonathan and Nikhil probably.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes.
Awesome.
So Nikhil, you want to give a brief update, and we can make a note of the same thing over here in the notes also about cluster registry and ingress, multi-cluster ingress.
Just to expound on Nikhil's point, and I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but I think the challenge isn't so much speaking about things in the context of this meeting. It's more like, how do we communicate to a broader audience that doesn't participate in these meetings what we're working on and what the status is?
Yeah, the concern I had was like I've seen discussions in Slack channel, even on email sessions. People are asking about, and like recently we've broken a lot of Federation users, especially with the new release and Federation not being in it. So a lot of people are asking about like what's happening and sometimes they don't get enough replies. So like one view I had was maybe we are building a consent or a perception that there's so many people in the SIG, but like what are they doing? Like there are so many questions about Federation or like what's happening in Federation, but like not as many people replying. Like I see so many people here in SIG meetings and on email discussions, but not everyone like working on Federation or other issues. So we should clarify. And we sent out an email to Kubernetes users when we renamed the SIG. We did that, but now we have more concrete other solutions as well, which others are working on. So you should probably communicate that as well, and people should know like what the SIG is working on. There are these multiple solutions.
And there's a wider audience of Kubernetes users. There's like, it's almost like hacker usable. You know what I mean? Like the group of people interested in Kubernetes don't always subscribe to those Google groups.
Yeah.
And I'm also curious
I don't know
about
what's the best solution, but we need a better way to communicate it.
yeah, and I'm also curious about. I have seen a lot of presence on the meetings by. I mean, sometimes the number is as big as 20 people attending a particular brainstorming meeting or a SIG meeting. I am not really sure who those people are. Are those users? And I have tried to ask this question earlier also. I mean, are they new developers looking to participate in the work, or are those users who are, if any of the people who are present here are new to this meeting, can speak up, it would be great to probably address this concern that Nikhil has raised. Okay,
I'm not sure that entirely addresses his concern, at least in my mind, but I do think there's value in participants sort of introducing themselves and maybe giving an indication of what their interest in the project is, whether just, keeping an eye on it, want to participate, whatever. But having a community kind of involves knowing one another. And if you're new, then please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hello. So my name's Matt Yakabuchi. Sorry, I just had to run in from, we've got a community space, and so I just grabbed a room. So yeah, I'm working for F5, and I got interested in SIG Multicluster attending KubeCon, the last KubeCon in Austin. And so I'm just, right now, I'm just trying to learn as much as I can about Federation and then seeing how we could possibly contribute in the future.
Okay.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, I'm Chakri. So I work for a startup called Diamante. So we actually build a Kubernetes appliance, and I'm heavily involved in the storage SIG actually. So right now we are trying to add support for kind of a hybrid cloud and a multi-cluster platform based on our appliance. So I'm getting involved. So I will also be actively looking if I have any questions, I'll ping. And going forward, I'm willing to take up some of the work to make things work in a multi-cluster environment. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Leah. I work for Samsung, and we're also working on a multi-cluster kind of cluster ops solution. And I've been hearing a lot about Federation over the last year and a half or so. And so I just thought I would try and join the community and see what the status is.
Great, welcome.
I can go next. My name is Nilesh Chinarkar. I'm part of the Google team working on the multi-cluster area. I'm a program manager.
My name is Michael Rubin. I'm a manager at Google for a whole bunch of stuff in Kubernetes, ranging from like storage, multi-cluster, operating systems, and sort of random stuff. I like the word stuff. And I've been involved in multi-cluster and Federation for about 2 years now. So I've seen this group, evolve and change and grow into where it is today. Very happy to be here.
We know you, Michael, and do we need to introduce all of us, or?
I don't know. I feel like, do we have enough people that makes sense?
Yeah, my intention was just to get to know the people who actually sort of are getting regular on these meetings, but are not known to the SIG participants who have been historically participating with the SIG.
Got it. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
No, I think there might be value in people actually introducing themselves in general, just because if you're new, you don't necessarily know the who's who.
Yeah, that also makes sense. Yep.
So I think Mike's example is a good one.
Okay. I can tell about myself. I'm Irfan. I work with I am Irfan. I work with Huawei, and I have been involved with this SIG Federation, when it was SIG Federation, and now with as multi-cluster since almost a year now. Sorry, Christian, you can go next.
All right, I'll go next. My name is Christian Bell. I've been involved with this SIG for about 1 year now. I'm one of the SIG co-leads with Quentin, who's not present here. I work for Google, if that's not apparent based on the laptop going around. My main focus is to make sure that we address multi-cluster problems and not necessarily focus on federating the Kubernetes API as is. As a result of that, we have various efforts like the Federation Working Group itself, which is focused on developing APIs that we think map to use cases that people are trying to solve in the multi-cluster world. And at Google, we have our own projects that are all reflected as well in the open source, and those are Cluster Registry and Cube MCI, which is multi-cluster ingress. And on that, I'll pass the laptop to the main developer of that.
Hi, I'm Nikhil. I've been part of the SIG since it was started, earlier working on Federation, and now focusing on Cube MCI, the multi-cluster ingress.
Hi, I'm Greg Harmon. I'm working on the Cube MCI with Nikhil. I've been on this group since September, and I'm ramping up and starting work on controller stuff.
Hello, I'm Jonathan. I also work for Google. I've been working in the SIG for about the past year, starting a federation and now focusing mainly on the cluster registry. Yeah.
So one of the things I think we need to address, and I started out already by circulating a document that I'm going to send over to the SIG, is right now our landing page doesn't really reflect any of what we just discussed as we went around the table, in that there are separate ongoing efforts. Unless you attend every single meeting, and even there I'm not sure, you don't really know where to go to find all the efforts that we've covered in the last 3 minutes. So I think we need to address that on the community page. And that's my action item for this week. I'll circulate that as a doc, a Google Doc. People feel free to comment. If you think that the effort that you're currently working on is not appropriately reflected in that document, and then I'll convert that to Markdown and submit that to the community repo. I think it's important to attach names to the efforts, not just links, just so we know what people are working on, and whether attendance every time you have a SIG meeting makes sense based on what the topics are being discussed.
Cool. Thank you, Christian.
Hey, this is Christopher Luciano. Another note in there for possible things. So I work on mostly Kubernetes networking and resource management working group stuff, but I've also kind of get involved in this from the Istio perspective because we're interested in how the cluster API is working out and how that'll integrate with mesh inside of Istio. So interest mainly from that end, but also in Kubernetes Anywhere tests from the SIGNet side, which we're using that repository mainly to start up some CNI plugins, like third-party CNI plugins to test things like network policy. And some of the issues brought up in the Kubernetes Anywhere have been around kind of what the future of this is. Does it make sense to still use this within the end-to-ends if we're going to be migrating the cluster API? And if so, how soon should we update a lot of those test frameworks that are kind of continuously failing?
Okay, Christopher, I don't know if you were present last week, not last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry, this was the last SIG meeting. Gautam from the Istio effort came and gave a presentation on how Istio planned to consume the cluster registry.
I was not there. We had a meeting 2 weeks ago, probably on that Friday. So it would have been after that time talking about some of the things you have to do with the Istio config working group. But I'm sure that they are fairly related.
Okay, yeah, I think mostly his, what he gave as a presentation was just to give us a heads up as to what Istio was working on and what the potential was for cross collaboration. Right now,
is a recording posted somewhere?
There is, yes.
Okay, I'll go ahead and watch that.
Does it make sense? We did this recently in the storage group. Like, where's the camera? We did this recently in the storage group, whereby we had enough new interest in a whole bunch of areas. We sort of had a ramp-up meeting out of band. It wasn't one of the regular meetings. We just set up something that let folks that maybe were not going to every meeting religiously for a long time sort of ask questions and get the context for what we're trying to do, and a wider scope, because the storage SIG scope could widen considerably. Would that be something that people would find useful? I know I see some new faces, and I know that there are maybe more wider faces. We could advertise this in the community site, the community meeting, not have a whole SIG update, but just say, hey, if you're interested in what's going on, we're going to have an hour session, 20 minutes of prep, and then 40 minutes of Q&A. There's silence in this room. I can't tell. Not even
That sounds interesting to me, Michael.
That seems useful.
And seems
I
useful,
agree.
yes.
Yeah.
So then let's say that we'll take an action item in this room at least to get that started on the mailing list and kick it off. And it's really, really low cost to do on the members of the SIG. And I think it might be a way to bring everyone up to speed. I think the biggest thing is just getting those like 3 minutes or 3 seconds inside the community meeting. That shouldn't be that difficult. We can probably get that done next week.
May I suggest that we can do it as at the same time slot as this community meeting? Maybe take the time slot of the next community meeting.
I think
because
that,
there hasn't been much on the agenda lately.
So I think the community meeting and having a SIG update, I think we should do a SIG update for multi-cluster, definitely. But I think this sort of meeting is something that could go on for a while and be very interactive. And what I've noticed in the community meeting is that it's not always the best forum to have a lot of people pepper other people with questions. So, you know, what I like about this meeting that happened with the storage SIG and a few in the scheduling SIG too was that it was very interactive. So you could get people who said, hey, what's going on here? Or I don't understand what you just said. Can you repeat it or say it in a different way to make sure that it's more clear? And I think with the community meeting, with just the breadth of the audience and it's a little unwieldy to get all of those questions done in sort of the chat side, as opposed to even getting people to more easily ask questions verbally. I don't know if it lends itself as well to this forum. I think that when it's done, we should probably definitely do a multi-cluster update. I think we are getting a little past due for that. But I feel like that's more of information coming out as opposed to a dialogue. I don't know if the community meeting lends itself well to a dialogue. And now I've said that 3 times in 3 different ways. So all this stuff.
Okay, let's do it.
Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, it does make sense. What I was only suggesting is that we can float this idea and use up a time slot of the community meeting. Given that there hasn't been much on the agenda lately, and this is already reserved for most of the folks up here.
I think Irfan is suggesting that we have our session independently of the community meeting at the same time slot as the community meeting, overlapping community meeting.
I don't know. I always feel weird about doing anything at the same time.
But anything else is also fine. Okay.
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, I'm open to whatever the SIG wants. We can just schedule it over email on the SIG list.
Okay. So I'll probably just send out a mail to the mailing list.
Well, I think maybe
to
go to the community meeting first, let a wider audience know that we're going to do this, and say, if you're interested, subscribe to our mailing list. Otherwise, we'd subscribe to the list, then we'd advertise, and people wouldn't know, you know, how to contribute to the time and place. I expect that there might even be a doodle for scheduling.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. But what exactly do you mean by wider than the multi-cluster mailing list? You mean the Kubernetes mailing list?
So yeah. So I think one of the goals of this would be to spread the word wider than the people who are currently subscribed to the multi-cluster Google Groups list. Mm-hmm. And so we can broaden that message by going to the community meeting, which has a very wide audience.
Okay.
So step 1, go to that meeting and say, hey, we're going to throw a party, as opposed to just throwing a party to the people that are in the know already. And then after we say, if you want to learn about the party, come to our list. Then people would come to the list. We could schedule the party together. I'm sorry, I like to say party. And then we would have, hopefully, you know, we'd broaden the group of people that we would be able to engage with this that way. As opposed to if we started it on the list only, then we might get a smaller subset of folks to talk to. And the goal of this is to widen that group of people.
Okay. Sounds good to me. Yeah, sounds good to me.
Christian, do you want to do this just to show up at the community meeting, or?
Yeah, I mean, to me it sounds like office hours.
Yeah, it might be a little office hours, but I think it should be office hours with an initial, like 20-minute, here's where we are status update for not a super detailed, this is where the code lives, and this is the, you know, the pieces of the API, but more 10,000 foot status update. Because otherwise, I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes I would go to office hours in school and not even know what I didn't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, Scott had a comment here about something like a newsletter. I posted a link. Scott, is there something you can say about what you suggested? Whether that complements what we just talked about, or?
Ooh. Sure. So, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So Josh Burkus has started a last week in Kubernetes development mailing list. That's most people here are familiar with like Kubernetes Weekly, but that's like from a broader ecosystems, you know, reference. Who's writing what blog posts, what presentations happen, what meetups are going on. But this is basically a summary for folks like developers who are contributing to Kubernetes who want to know what's going on in other SIGs. So that might be a good place for like a, kind of a last weekend multi-cluster. What PRs got merged, what the release schedule looks like, is there anything being blocked at a very high level. So you can imagine like one sentence, one link, maybe 3 to 4 links a week if it's pertinent. And, that way the entire community gets to see what's going on here. And if they want more information, then they can come join the SIG or, talk about the office hours that Michael was referring to earlier.
Okay, sounds interesting. I'll take a look at it as action item.
But Scott, what you are suggesting seems to be for this, at least multi-cluster community, seems to be captured in the meeting notes generally.
Yeah, I was thinking of that, but sometimes there are a lot of notes from different SIGs to cruise through, and what I was, I think the purpose of this is to be a high-level summary for people who are deep into the development and also people who are following the project in general, who may not even know which SIGs are out there and what notes to peruse through. But it's much more high level than the detailed meeting minutes.
Are you volunteering to distill those details into high level notes for a weekly newsletter? Because that would be great. I find that to be just yet another sort of periodic task where, as you can tell, I'm a talker. So for me, it seems to make more sense, like maybe once a quarter, to have, an out-of-band session to let people have a dialogue. But if you want to do like a weekly newsletter, and I'm a huge fan of LWN, but I also know that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I don't know how much bang for the buck we get out of it, unless we have someone motivated to do so.
So Mike, how about if we added a section to the agenda each week that would go in the newsletter? And if everyone, if we can come to some consensus about what those 3 high-level topics are, I can just send them out as part of this this last week in Kubernetes development. I don't mind.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Does that sound cool? I mean, we just had 2 people say something and there's like 15 people in the room. I mean, what do other people think?
It's fine. Scott, I don't know if you're present even at the working group meeting. Can you distill those notes as well?
I haven't been attending the, which group meeting are you talking about? The Federation?
Fed V2 working group meetings.
I haven't been attending, but I can. This is something I'm following pretty closely from Red Hat's side.
Yeah, but we also generally provide an update from that, or we can provide an update from that in the SIG. So then it will be part of the SIG meeting.
Sure. Yeah, why don't we give it a go and we can pilot it for a few weeks and see if there's any value add, and then we'll revisit.
No, I think it's a great idea. I just wonder about commitment to it, and if you're committed, it would have a lot of value.
All right, sounds good.
Next on the agenda.
Actually, there is nothing else specifically on the agenda today apart from what you have put, Mikkel. Federation-wise, there isn't some very specific update except a couple of PRs that have been merged, some issue fixes, and some release scripts that we are working on. Cluster registry, I know that there has been one more release cut out with an issue fix, which was v0.0.3.
Yeah.
Apart from that, if there is some update, Jonathan, you can probably talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So there have been, the big.
Hello.
Okay, let's try that again.
Oh, okay.
Hey, sorry about that.
I thought I'm the only guy who is disconnected.
We were all muted.
Okay.
So yeah, the big release thing this past week was the v0.0.3 release. Some other things that have been going on. I circulated a few weeks ago with a smaller group a testing plan with an intention to try to determine what sort of testing strategy made sense for the cluster registry I will share that out with the SIG more broadly. Anybody who wants to take a look at that and maybe contribute comments and feedback is certainly welcome to do so. Here's a high-level overview of that plan is that the cluster registry is a very simple project, but it also has the potential to be very foundational. And so we want to make sure that we have a good strategy for making sure that it works well in different environments. So making sure that it's compatible across versions of Kubernetes, that it works across relevant versions of etcd, that it aggregates well with different Kubernetes versions, and making sure that this can all be tested on releases is something that I think will become very important for us, especially as we approach a more generally available release later on in the year. I see Maru has pointed out one of the next things I wanted to talk about is that there has been some trouble for people vendoring in the cluster registry, which is something that I've taken note of. A potential strategy, an idea I had and have proposed as an issue in order to fix this, but at some point we'll probably want feedback on, is I'm considering splitting out into 2 repositories, having the cluster registry API live more or less by itself in one repository, which should have a very small set of dependencies and should be very easy for everyone to depend on. So that would contain the cluster registry, the API, plus any generated clients and generated code for the cluster registry. And then the cluster registry with the API server and CRinit that exists now would live in a separate repository that depends on that. I think that would potentially increase the maintenance burden on the cluster registry side, but it would make it, from what I can tell, significantly easier for other projects to vendor in the cluster registry API, which I believe is the only thing that most other projects should need to vendor in. Another project that wants to actually vendor in the cluster registry API server and CRinit itself would probably have a harder time of that, since CRinit and the cluster registry will have more dependencies and have more tight definitions of how they want their dependencies, of what versions of their dependencies they want to use. So that, I think, is something that will probably happen, assuming that there's agreement, or that's if somebody else proposes another strategy, which would be a better strategy, we will move forward and try and work on that over the next few weeks. Other than that, we had a discussion a few weeks ago about bringing the API to beta and came up with 2 major points that we wanted to make sure that we worked out before the beta timeframe, one of which was more contentious than the other. So the more contentious point was whether the cluster resource, the object itself, should be namespace scoped rather than cluster scoped. Paul Morey was at some point going to write up his thoughts around this. I'm not sure he has done that yet. When he has, it will probably end up on an issue in the repository. And if he doesn't write that up in the next few days, I can also take that on to write up our thoughts around that and make sure that the issue is very clear. It's a bit of a tricky issue because namespacing clusters has some benefits in terms of allowing users to have to authorize clients of the cluster registry to access only a subset of the available clusters in a registry, which is a desirable feature and something that we want in the registry. But it also brings quite a bit of baggage with the way namespaces are designed for the Kubernetes concept. For the way namespaces are designed for Kubernetes, that potentially make the cluster registry harder to use or could lead to some complications and confusions. So it's something that we want to consider carefully before doing it. I think those are probably the main updates at this point. Yeah, as always, we're looking for contributors. If you want to help, there's issues in the repository that we definitely want feedback on, and there are things that are marked as help wanted in the repository. Yeah, thank you.
Is it too early to try to put a due date on this namespacing issue? I think it's somewhat of a big blocker.
I don't think it's too early. The goal was to have a beta version of the cluster registry by mid-February. At this point, I think it might be better to think about it by the end of February, depending on how soon the discussions can be completed. But I would hope to have a decision on that issue within the next, or by the next SIG meeting, to have a decision on that issue. and then potentially over the next few weeks to do the implementation work necessary to enact that decision.
Did you say you have a design doc or something that you're going to post that you're going to solicit feedback on?
So there will be a testing plan which I will send around, which is a Google Doc. I can write up the thoughts about the betaization of the API that we had, try and coalesce them into a doc as well so that people can comment on it. I will try to do that and send that out, both of those out later this week.
Great. And does this relate at all to, I saw a proposal, I think, in the community repo about cluster-wide resources. Any relation to that?
Not that I know of. I'm not familiar.
Was it for the Kubernetes cluster-wide resources? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this should not impact that.
There should be no relation here. So I'm not familiar with that proposal. So I will at least take a look at it. And if there is some overlap, then I will address it more particularly. Thank you.
Yeah, I could try to find it and post it, I guess in this Slack channel. Is that good?
That'd be perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. So federation updates are something that majority of the effort over there is now focused on figuring out V2 API. And once we are done with that, we would probably have some update strategy from the current project or API. And so far, what we are doing in terms of, if you consider the Federation repo, what the work that is going on over there is only some amount of issue fixes or some scripts which can enable the release. But I don't think there is any specific user or specific set of people who's actually waiting for this particular release to happen. There is one outstanding task which, because of the rest of the work that has been happening around the V2 API, has taken a back burner, which was updating the documents at the current documentation, which is around Federation, so that the users get the correct idea of what transition is happening or how the transition is happening. I should be able to complete that within the coming week, by the next SIG meeting at least. There is some update about the V2 API workgroup discussion that probably is relevant to the SIG also. So we have been recently meeting as regularly as twice a week, and twice a week happened from last week onwards. So we had 2 meetings last week, and we had one meeting on this Monday this week and another scheduled tomorrow. So that API seems to be taking quite a good shape. At least the areas around which we should be focusing, how or what pointers should be addressed inside the API. And Maru has taken up the effort to start prototyping, which might be the initial files which might look like the Federation V2 API. Maru, if you have any update about that, you can probably speak now.
Not really too much to say. I'm working first on just getting integration, like the aggregation with cluster registry, which involves vendoring, and that's kind of sticky, as I mentioned in chat. So, but once that's done, hopefully I'll be able to make rapid progress getting validating some of the discussions that we've been having, with the goal of sort of feeding back into that discussion, hopefully being able to iterate like more quickly to get to kind of a vision for what we want to accomplish, what's going to be doable, what makes sense, what doesn't, rather than just kind of fixing on a design and then doing like big design up front, which I don't think I have problems with. So that's about it. I'm just trying to make that happen.
Rouge never had problems.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to clarify that what we're striving for, at least in the working group meetings, is to get some agreement on the concepts to eventually get to a V2 API, and not necessarily. I don't think we're agreeing on what that API looks like. I'm just making that distinction because of the way you presented it earlier, Irfan.
You're right, Christian. So, I mean, I probably didn't say it correctly. So the workgroup meetings have been focused around, as Christian said, to clear out the concepts and have an agreement across the SIG or all the relevant parties who are interested in the federating this API.
Just
Okay.
to follow on with that, I was a bit vague. The goal that I'm trying to get to is to basically have a few representative types like secret, replica set, and be able to define those federated types, define probably placement, maybe overrides, and have them propagated to member clusters, and trying to sort of take the design as we've discussed it so far, kind of chart a course through that, and then give people an opportunity to look at it, play with it, give them some a concrete realization of some of the discussion, and then hopefully that can inform the decision making. It's not intended to sort of converge us so much as just explore the problem space in a way that discussion maybe is difficult. It's difficult to achieve with discussion.
Yeah, that sounds right. Okay, there is nothing else which is there from my side on the agenda. If there is something else that we want to talk apart from this.
Is this the right place to bring up Kubernetes Anywhere? Or
if there is some relevant point, we can talk about it.
Mainly on, is it owned by this group or not? I guess is a...
No.
No, Kubernetes Anywhere is not owned by this group. There is a SIG cluster lifecycle. I think they are the relevant people to talk about Kubernetes Anywhere also.
What is Kubernetes Anywhere?
It is a mechanism. Okay, I am not sure who was talking. You can explain if you know already about it.
I'm sorry, this is Michael.
Christopher.
Okay.
What is
Oh yeah, it's combining together a few things like JSON, Terraform, and general cloud provider specific things. And it was a way of having a common staged rollout for your Kubernetes cluster for any given cloud backend that someone chose to implement it for. The first step would basically be like select how you want your cluster to kind of be designed, then select if you want to use something like CoreOS Bootstrap Ignition or Kubernetes or kubeadm. Then the third stage was actually use kubeadm to provision the cluster on top of your machines, which was using Terraform to get the machines. And then the final step was launch any additional add-ons. So it feels very similar to like what some of the examples were for the cluster API, at least moving forward, the GCP example that I saw. So that's maybe kind of what drove me to bring it up here.
This is a perspective, and I'm curious if it resonates with you at all. My feeling is there's a set of operations that you will be able to run on a specific cluster, whether or not you have multiple clusters or not. And they have to deal with the provisioning of the cluster and dealing kind of more with the what I call the southbound interface of Kubernetes. To me, I look at Kubernetes as like a layered system where the bottom piece is the part that sits on top of the infrastructure that we have around us, which is either compute, it could be like VMware VMs or bare metal or storage or the network infrastructure. If I understand it correctly, and I may not be, I think what you're describing are the sets of operations that you need to portably provision and manage a Kubernetes cluster, in a bunch of different places. To me, I think that the scope of this group, which is already pretty wide, has to deal with the interactions between clusters, sort of more of a north direction, whereby, how do we, it may interact with those systems, but I think that it could almost be feature creep or too broad a scope if this group wasn't just invoking those APIs, but also developing them. Like, I think we should have input maybe in those efforts, but probably not ownership. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mainly wanted to bring it up here before I take it back to SIG cluster lifecycle. Because specifically in one of the notes when we were trying to add CI testing for that repository so that the end-to-end tests could more easily be fixed instead of like checking in a SHA. They specifically called out the cluster API is the thing that would potentially replace Kubernetes anywhere moving forward.
So I guess you should talk to the cluster lifecycle folks. I talked to them a bunch, and we can take this offline maybe because I don't want to take too much SIG multi-cluster time on it. But I think my understanding is Kubernetes everywhere is sort of an effort and a goal, and cluster API is a product to help us achieve that goal. I don't know, I think this is where, again, names and efforts and other semantics can get confusing, but that's at least how I look at it.
Yeah, and that definitely gives me more context to work from. Thanks.
I think our paths may cross, but one way to say what we've been focused on is historically this SIG has only gotten involved at the point where the API servers for the underlying clusters are already provisioned up and running. And we kind of manage the API servers. That may change in the future in that there may be someone may choose to extend the cluster registry API server and plug in some Kubernetes anywhere to bring up another cluster and add it to a centralized registry. But right now, our base assumption is that clusters are already up and running. Hoping that helps.
Yeah, I think the TLDR is that cluster API would potentially be used downstream by Kubernetes anywhere, but doesn't inherently replace it.
Yes. Also, that Christian looks a lot happier when we're in the camera together. You see the beaming happiness.
Okay, and that was a good analogy to Christian, Michael.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, we have 15 more minutes, and I don't think we have anything else to talk today. We can close early too.
Maybe you want to summarize the expectations by next meeting. At least I have as an action item to send out a document to reflect the various efforts going on under the SIG. Scott, are you going to report back, or are you just going to go ahead and send that first newsletter?
I was going to wait until you had finished here, but I wanted to get kind of a verbal, consensus about what the top 2 or 3 things we wanted to discuss for this meeting in the newsletter were going to be. The biggest thing, like the takeaway that I was following was that we're going to start an office hours meeting that we need to kind of evangelize and get out there. If there were going to be 2 other things that we added, what would that be?
Probably one word on cluster registry.
You're breaking up. I have a suggestion. Maybe this newsletter we can do post. Christian summarizes the set of efforts that's going on. Probably it will be more focused in that case.
Sure.
Does this sound okay, Christian? Or
I didn't get your comment entirely.
Oh, what I was saying is that once you would summarize this document which enlists all the efforts that we are going around in SIG Multicluster, and it'll be more clearer to. After that, the newsletter probably would have more focus.
Sure. Okay, that's fine. That's a good suggestion, actually.
Okay, so anything else that we expect by the next meeting?
Diamante is also getting more interested in this area, and they reached out to me. I think that, I'll see if I can get them to subscribe to the list. And they have a history of doing great contributions to all the SIGs I've seen them involved in. So,
Michael, I'm here. This is Chakri.
You're here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't see you there.
Yeah, I've been attending the last few years, few meetings actually. I was involved initially, but now we are getting very, very serious about it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm glad I had great things to say.
Yep, thank you.
Well, come on in, dude. We can't wait to see you, hopefully have more time to contribute even more.
Yep, looking forward to it.
All right, and I'll say thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Take care,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.